I'm Nick, and I am going to be starting us off today with a little topic that's near and dear to my heart. And that topic is time travel in video games. Even though this presentation is called Time Travel in Video Games, it's really time travel and video games. And we're going to be talking about time travel, and a bunch of related shenanigans as we go along. And I'm going to be using examples from different games that kind of demonstrates some real world scientific time travel, if we can call it that, which we are going to call it that for now. A bit of housekeeping, just because I'm going to give the impression that I know a lot about science, and that is not true. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a scientist. If you know more about this than me, great, fantastic. Let the rest of the class know, because I am probably going to learn things too. I'm not a philosopher. I can't tell you if time is real or not. I honestly don't know, and that is not germane to the conversation that we are having today. I just love time travel, and I'm doing my best. So I'm going to try to make this understandable for everyone. We're also going to be talking about video games, and that might seem obvious, but when you're talking about time travel in video games, time travel in a video game almost definitely means we are going to be spoiling something. So sorry, I'm going to try to limit the spoilers, but it's going to be unavoidable because time travel is all twists and the big reveal and stuff. It's also really hard to talk about things that you haven't experienced. So I'm going to be talking about games that I have played. There might be games that you have played that you think are really cool time travel related games. Put them in the chat. Put them in the Kanji Discord. Let me know, because I probably want to play / have played them, maybe. It can be narrative, it can be mechanical, whatever. Talk about it all. Chat is very shy, and we are ready for this. Okay, this is going to be like a quick little bit for you in the chat, and less me talking, at least for a little second. I'm doing some stalling so that you have the time to respond. Time travel is incredibly pervasive as a concept. I joke with friends every time time travel comes up in a video game. It's like, they did it, they did the thing again. But video games have only been around for the last 40 or 50 years, and humans have existed for longer than that. So before we get into talking about the good stuff, the time travel-y bits, I have a question for folks in the chat, and that is, how long have we been talking about time travel? Not me today, but humans, like in general. Since when have we been doing that for? Post your answers in the chat. I will give you a second, which is just giving me enough time to conveniently get a glass of water. Which is conveniently an Erlenmeyer flask, a very sciencey thing. Forever. Yep, that's a good guess. Some thinking going on in the chat. Well, that's cool. I'm short for time. I measured this. I measured the time. I counted the time. It turns out, I say I'm not a scientist. It turns out that we have been talking about time travel for a long. What's the Donner man? Hey! Oh, yeah. This panel is so meta. Turns out a long time. So a lot of folks are familiar with the 1985 series of films Back to the Future. Yeah, we got the time machine that's on here. Perfect. Back to the Future popularized it definitely in the mid 80s. If we're talking about hard science, a certain Mr. Albert Einstein came up with the theory of relativity around the turn of the previous century. Oh, that seems weird. There was the time machine, technically a Christmas Carol. These are all examples where time goes, where people travel forwards and backwards in time, which is really cool. Because backwards time travel is a pretty recent thing as far as fiction goes. I have some other examples here that you might not have heard of. There's a supplement to Journey to the West, which is the story that Dragon Ball is loosely based off of, which talks about mirrors that look back in time. That's cool. That was in the 1640s. There's some like Japanese stories about a fisherman who visits an undersea palace for 3 days and hundreds of years have passed. That was in like the 750s. That's a long time ago. There is There are tales from Islamic myth of people sealing themselves in a cave to avoid persecution and being kept for hundreds of years. But it goes back even further. There's like this Jewish scholar, Honiha Magel, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry, who supposedly fell asleep for 70 years. Again, this is a myth. So we don't know if it's true. And there was something even earlier, 400 before Common Era. There's an Indian set of myths called the Vishnu Purana. I'm really bad with names here, where people travel to meet the creator of the world, Brahma, and when they learn to Earth, like so much time has passed. Forward time travel, not backwards time travel, which is neat. I was like, I had no idea that we were doing that had happened, unless somebody has messed with the timeline, in which case this is completely wrong. We're going to be talking about time travel today, and that means talking about a lot of concepts about time and space-time and fourth dimensions and a bunch of other stuff. And before we get to the science, the examples, I'm going to mention we're going to be talking today about meaningful time travel, because when you see in some examples, you're going to learn there's a lot of kinds of time travel that we really don't care to talk about today. For example, we're not talking about the perception of time travel. You know, you're like, oh, it feels like the weekend flew by, or it feels like I barely slept. Sleeping is a good example of the perception of time travel. There are some games like Skyrim where you can decide how long you sleep, which, like, fantastic. I wish I could do that. Which also have the other non-real bunch of shenanigansy stuff where you can feel well rested. This is just a lie. This is just not real. Technically, we traveled through. Yes, 1001 Paper Boxes is on the ball, because I was literally about to mention that. When we're talking about time travel today, we are not talking about games that just show the passage of time, because technically we are time traveling right now. We are time traveling at a rate of 1 second per second, approximately. It's boring, but it's true. And so we don't care about games that show time passing. This is from Breath of the Wild. You can see on the map where you went. You can technically see your personal timeline, which is cool, not interesting for today's conversation. Ghosts don't count. We don't care about echoes of the past. We don't even care when you can see multiple timelines coalescing. Super Meat Boy is a platforming game. It's hard. But one thing that's neat is at the end of the level, it shows where you failed, but it shows all of the places you failed, playing it simultaneously. Super cool as a game mechanic, not useful for our conversations today. I know this is like a laundry list of we're not doing this, but I think it's important because it also lets us show off other game mechanics that are used to talk about time travel. Technically, advancing time, doing like a day-night cycle, like in Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, using things like the Sun Song, technically time travel. I'm not going to argue about that. It is technically time travel. But it's not super interesting to talk about because it's just a game mechanic. It's not real. It's not scientifically doing anything. It's just like the player needs to advance time, so we're going to do that. So we're not talking about that. And lastly, and I swear lastly, and we'll also explain why this is so important. We're not talking about games where you can reset time. I'm not judging anybody who's been playing Animal Crossing and wants to go back in time and get some stuff from Red the Fox, or like go back and play the stock market. You know what? You do you. But like scientifically, we don't have anything where we can do this. Don't upset Rossetti. Yeah. I mean, I think he's also calmed down a bit in his venerable age. Technically, when you change the clock in Animal Crossing, you're time traveling. That's cool. Kind of just an abstract game thing. What about time skips? Oh my God, I forgot entirely about time skips. We're not talking about those today, but those would probably be relevant. That's more of a narrative device, though. And mostly we're going to talk about like the intersection of science and mechanics and a little bit about narrative. Okay, why did I say we're not talking about all of these things? Well, primarily the reason is because if we talk about all those things, then I can sit here and with a straight face say, all right, everybody, let's talk about everybody's favorite time travel game, chess, which I don't think most people would say that chess is a time traveling game. And I don't want to talk about it as a time traveling game either. Unless, unless. Okay, more. I'm actually going to come back to this, but it's going to be a while. We're going to have to time travel to the future to get to that. Okay. So, if we're not talking about all these like half dozen cases, what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to talk about time travel in the many ways that we can talk about time travel. There's so many things that we can talk about in time talking about time travel. These words, I just tried to have a pithy summary and the symbols to try to help us understand the concepts. But like broadly, today we're going to talk about the direction of time travel, about moving forwards and backwards through time, or possibly in another direction. Small fun fact: did you know that different cultures talk about time differently? In English speaking countries, we talk about time as moving from left to right, forwards and backwards, that kind of stuff. But other countries and cultures think of time as moving like top to bottom or bottom to top, right to left. And in some places, they actually think of time as moving through the perceiver. So, like, time literally moves through your head. And it's like forward is the future, or backwards is, I can't remember. It was fascinating. Um, we'll also be talking about how mutable time is. Can history be changed, or is it fixed? Is there a single timeline? Circular, yeah, exactly. Is there one timeline, or are there multiple timelines? How much does time converge or diverge? Is it mostly a straight line? Does it have multiple branching paths? All of that kind of stuff. I should point out that we don't have answers to a lot of these questions, because time isn't something that we can just manipulate and experiment on like we do most of our science. So a lot of this is theoretical, and we're going to have to keep that into perspective as we talk about time travel today. We're going to focus starting with the stuff that like maybe this could actually happen, and then move on to the like, okay, I don't think this is really real, and then okay, if time travel works, then shenanigans, and then paradoxes. Because the more we talk about time, the more wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, sometimey it is. Okay, science time. Which cultures think of time with different directions? I'll have to find the article after this, because it's fascinating, because it affects how we think. But that's a different topic. Our first lesson, which is barely a lesson, which I think people implicitly understand, is the idea of cause and effect. Pretty much everything related to time travel definitely depends on causality. Causality is a surprisingly deep metaphysical and philosophical subject, but for our purposes, we only care about one thing, which, like, a cause happens and that introduces an effect. A cause happens in the past, the effect is in the future. A second later, an hour later, days, weeks, etc. Doesn't matter. An interesting thing scientifically, we don't know why this is. We don't know why time and causality flows in one direction. We just know that it does. If it were to flow backwards, I don't know how that would work. But this is kind of the underpinning of everything we talk about with time travel today. So keep that in mind. And as an example of a game that demonstrates causality, the answer is literally any game. Every game has causality. That's not super interesting. But since we're talking about time travel, and since we're talking about timelines, a good example that demonstrates causality is a game called It's a Wrap. And It's a Wrap is a game, it's a puzzle platformer where you are a movie star and you have a script. And what you need to do is make the script happen. You can do that by manipulating different elements in the scene. Once the scene is set up in the way that you think is correct, you can play out the scene and act it. And you're trying to make everything happen so that the story can continue. It's fun. It makes fun of a bunch of older movies. Like if you like Indiana Jones, I think the first few chapters are all Indiana Jones. But also, kind of thinking about this out loud, if you know of a game that does not have causality, I don't even know how that works, let me know, because I'm fascinated by the possibility of this. So this is plausible. Like, no problems here. It's not even plausible, it's possible, it happens. Like, causality is just a thing. So this game nails it. Good job. It's a wrap. But that's boring, right? Like, causality happens every day. I'm talking to you right now and you're experiencing causality. So let's keep talking about things that might be possible. Could we travel from where we are now in the present into the future? Is that a possibility? Is that a real thing that we could do? We might not be able to do it with, say, a DeLorean or a time machine of that sort. But it turns out that we actually could maybe travel forwards in time, but maybe not in the way that you expect. It's theoretically possible, and in fact, in some small cases, is actually possible. We can observe it. There is a game called Braid, and Braid is a fantastic game that talks about. Well, it doesn't talk about time travel. It's all about time manipulation, fast forwarding time, rewinding time, playing with timelines, sort of. It's full of time related mechanics, and the narrative is interesting too. I don't remember it very well, but the ending is kind of a what the heck. We're not going to focus on most of the game, which I think doesn't necessarily use time other than just as a mechanic. We're going to talk about this part right now, which I believe is in World 4, where you get this ring. And what this ring does is when you set it down, it allows you to slow down time. It slows down time in a bubble. And more than that, time slows down differently depending on where you are in the bubble. If you're close to the ring in the bubble, time is slowed down a lot. As you're towards the edge, it slows down a little bit, and it's like a gradation between those two things. As it turns out, first of all, this is plausible because there's a real life phenomenon called time dilation, which we can use to travel forwards in time, sort of. But in order to do that, we need to talk about science again. In fact, we need to talk about our good old friend Al Einstein and his theory of relativity back from the turn of the 20th century. There was a lot of things we didn't know about science, like how time and space are linked together, and a lot of things about gravity. Gravity is like a lot of the stuff that impacts his theory of relativity. We know, for example, that gravity is the force of gravity is what causes things like orbits. It's why the Earth rotates around the sun and doesn't just fly off into space. As it turns out, gravity also impacts time. So on the left, we have a sun, which is a sun. And on the right, we have a black hole, because that was the emoji that looked like a black hole. And in both cases, gravity causes things in space to orbit around. But the other thing that gravity causes is time dilation. Something that exerts more gravitational force slows down time more. So if you were close to the sun, let's say so much time would pass. If you spent the same time for you orbiting a black hole or closer to a black hole, even though it feels like the same amount of time, less time would have passed for you than somebody in a different place outside of that frame of reference, which is weird to think about, to think that like being in one spot affects how time travels for you. And what's interesting about this is that it's all relative. So when we're talking about Braid here, it looks like, well, he's not fast forwarding through time. He's moving really slowly. But that's from our perspective. From our perspective, outside of the bubble. If we were inside the bubble, it would look like everything else is moving incredibly fast. Or I guess in this case, slightly faster. That's like the theory of relativity in a nutshell. And one thing to note is that this isn't theoretical. We've tested this. There are things called atomic clocks, which are very precise, very reliable time measurement devices. And we put some in space and some on Earth. And the one on Earth, less time has passed because being on Earth, there's a stronger gravitational force. And being in space, less time because there's less gravitational force. This isn't theoretical. This is actual time travel. This is time dilation. In a lot of talk about close to light speed travel or faster than light travel. We're not going to talk about faster than light yet because it's complicated. Lots of spacefaring games have near light speed travel. I think even Starfield might do this with time dilation. And when you're doing that, you can also fast forward time because it turns out that when you are an object that has mass and you are accelerating really fast, like the speed of light, well, the formula for force, which gravity is a force, is mass times acceleration. So pretty much any mass moving really, 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 really fast is going to exert a huge amount of gravitational force, which means, just like when you're near a black hole, time slows down for you and moves really fast for everybody else, which means the effect of fast forwarding through time. Mass Effect, I want to mention because it's an example where this doesn't happen. I don't remember Mass Effect that well. I couldn't even tell you much about the game, except it's a sort of a third-person game where you can romance characters, and also there's a ending that people might not have been happy with. But in the game, there's this thing called the Mass Effect, which allows faster than light travel, communication, etc. That game doesn't have time dilation. So it's not like when you travel from one point to another point, hundreds of years has passed. In fact, it's instantaneous. And they get away with that in Mass Effect because the Mass Effect makes the mass of anything 0. I don't know how the rest of it works, but that's the magic of it. No mass, no force of gravity, no time dilation, no time travel. So it's not time travel, but that's fine. And so that's cool. Forwards time travel is a possibility, I guess. But who actually wants to travel to the future? Well, who wants to go back to the future when you go to the past? We all know that the juiciest, coolest, most wrinkling my brainiest stuff is going to the past and messing around, breaking things, accidentally becoming your own grandparents, stopping Hitler, all that stuff, whatever. Is that possible? Could we actually travel backwards in time? Save us, video games, from this boring, mundane reality. Futurama, he literally becomes his own grandfather. Shenanigans. Bad news. Bad news, everybody. Probably not. As far as we know scientifically, aside from time dilation, which is like a weird special case, we don't think time travel is possible. Aside from the fact that we don't know what would happen if we went back in time, because it throws our notion of causality out the window. We don't know how we would travel back in time. I say we don't know how because, there are some theories that we have, but they don't all really work out. One of those is faster than light time travel. So it turns out we talk about light speed as the special thing, and a lot of our science is predicated on the idea that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. And that's because the speed of light is kind of like the speed of causality, as in nothing can be caused any faster than light can travel. If we could travel faster than light, that might imply that effects could happen before causes. It gets really messy really fast. There are some theories that folks have about faster than light travel. There's this idea called the Alcubierre drive, which, if you've ever seen Star Trek, is kind of similar to that. In Star Trek, you have like a warp bubble around a spaceship. And what an Alcubierre drive is, it does that, except you're not moving through space physically. You're literally warping space around you. You're like squishing space in front of you and expanding it behind you, and you're moving. I think they also made fun of this in Futurama. You're not moving through the universe, you're moving the universe around you. It is weird, but it's impossible because it requires, negative energy or more energy than we could possibly produce. Doesn't matter, not possible. So that sucks. There's also these things called closed time-like curves, which are complicated, but they're points in space-time that somehow travel back to themselves. From my reading, we don't think this is possible in our universe with the configuration of our universe, which also, hey, did you know universes can have configurations? Because I didn't. It's complicated. Supposedly, there's a special kind of black hole that might exist. And if you had that, then maybe you could travel back in time, as far back in time as the black hole was created. The downside being, black holes have this immensely dense set of gravity and this thing called an event horizon, which is kind of a point of no return. And if you pass over that, nothing, not even light, can escape it. And as far as we know, if you wanted to do that weird time travel with this weird black hole, you would need to pass that event horizon, which means two things. One, goodbye. That's the first part. But 2, probably something called spaghettification, which is being strung out like spaghetti, which is also goodbye. I'm sorry. It's bad. It's bad news. The other way that we could maybe travel back in time is just build your own universe. Just do it. Just make it happen. But that's not interesting for our talks today because it's really complicated. And it's basically like, if you want to play a game, why don't you make your own video game? Didn't know that was a real thing. Yep. Oh my God. So it's like, well, that sucks. I really wanted to time travel. Is there something that we could possibly do that is real before we talk about the not real time travel? Because that's also interesting. And the answer is yes. And it's also implausible. But I do have a video game example for this because I could not find examples for these. It's very familiar to me. But first, we have to make a little detour and talk about something that you may know about and you might not know about. It comes up in a lot of sci-fi. There is one way that we might be able to travel through time, travel backwards in time, in fact, and that is a traversable wormhole. The easiest way to think about this is imagine everything is just a flat piece of paper, and we have an example here. If you wanted to go from point A to point B, if I want to go from here to another spot in my room, I have to walk over there. That takes time. If the distance is really far from like here to Japan, let's say, then it takes whatever amount of time to cover that distance, and that sucks. But if we could somehow fold time and we could connect my room in Japan without traveling physical distance, we could create a wormhole. That would be a shortcut between 2 points. And then instead of traveling the distance, we can take the direct route through shenanigans to Event Horizons. This is how you get Event Horizons. Yeah. So how does this relate to time travel? And this is complicated, let's say 1, you can create a wormhole. Don't know how you do that, but you can do that. Imagine in that situation. Step 1. Step 2, take one end of the wormhole, accelerate it to near the speed of light. So go back and do the time dilation thing that we talked about. Cool. I don't know how you do that because I don't know how you make a wormhole. Step 3, profit? No, step 3 is put the fast end near the original end. So now you have like two portals in space pretty much right next to each other. One of them is time dilated. The other one is not. And it turns out that if you do that and you walk in the time dilated end, then you will arrive at the other end before you left in the first place, because time is moving faster at the one end and because the points are next to each other. That's really hard to think about. I don't have a good example, and that is like probably the most theoretical example we have. But fortunately, we have a game that doesn't do this, but does use wormholes for time travel. And that is my favorite game of all time, Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is a game I love a lot, so we're not going to gush too much about it, especially because it doesn't do the science stuff that I just described. All the science stuff that I just described is an accident. I was waiting until we get here. I couldn't not talk about Chrono Trigger. Chrono Cross talks about some other time travel related stuff that is not actually in this presentation. Chrono Trigger is really a game where you and your friends accidentally end up time traveling and learning about a great mystery of the world that is going to cause an apocalypse in the year 1999. And you have to stop it. You don't have to stop it, but you decide to stop it. And so the game doesn't use time travel as a let's do science kind of thing. It uses it primarily as a narrative thing. We want to explore different time periods because that gives us different environments, gives us different characters, and lets us try to like have this mysterious element to it. But not really scientifically. The part that aligns with what we were just talking about with wormholes is that each time portal connects to the exact same location across different time periods. At the beginning of the game, you go to a place called the Millennial Fair in 1000 AD. It links to the exact same location in space on the world 600 or 400 years ago in 600 AD. All of the time portals work that way. What about portal games? Portal games don't necessarily have time travel. They have wormholes. That's like slightly different. You have to do some shenanigans to make a portal a wormhole. Okay, cool. That's great. So this is like Traversable wormholes may be possible. Chrono Trigger doing it, not really a thing. And that's it. That's all the time travel. Thanks everybody for hanging out. No, that's it as far as scientific time travel goes. Those are like the plausible-ish scenarios of traveling forwards and backwards in time. But there's a lot of stuff that isn't just forwards and backwards time travel that we can talk about, both narratively, gameplay, and even scientifically. And don't worry, I got you covered. I got you covered, everybody. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is, like, let's imagine that time travel is possible, that you can travel back in time. That's great. How can we do that in a way that doesn't make everything nonsense? If I can go back in time and kill my grandfather, or like change my career path or whatever, how did I leave in the first place? How can we have time travel and have it make sense? And it turns out physicists have thought about this. Not in those exact terms, though, and probably not in terms of time travel. There's this Russian physicist, Igor Dmitrievich Novikov, who's still alive today. I was surprised. Not because I just, anytime you hear a scientific figure, I'm like, oh, they're probably past. Like Einstein is long past. But he had this to say regarding physics, but in our case, time travel. And that is, the only solutions to the laws of physics that can occur locally in the real universe are those which are globally self-consistent. And that's a lot of word salad that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's something. The Wikipedia article on temporal paradoxes puts it in a little bit clearer language, which is, a time traveler can do anything that happened, but cannot do anything that did not happen. And that's a little bit clearer. Oh, so, yeah. So what does that mean? Like, that's just not, like, basically we're saying if time travel is possible, then things happen because they happened. Like, that feels like nonsense. So let's talk about it by example. Not a video game yet, but we will get to a video game example in just a second. There is, in practice, there's this thing called Polchinski's paradox. And the way that it works is, imagine, we're going to make things really simple. We're not doing what happens if you go back in time and stop some tragedy. We're just going to talk about a ball, a regular billiard ball. And we have a time portal. That's it. 2 pieces. Ball, time portal. We're going to roll the ball into the time portal. Except the exit to the time portal is going to cause the ball to collide with itself before it enters the time portal. Well, that's a problem. If the ball hits and goes off course, then it couldn't enter the time portal and it couldn't go off course. We have a paradox. Paradoxes are bad. Time travel is ruined. It's awful. Time travel is never possible, and I'm sad. I'm sad forever. It turns out that's possible, but let's assume that we can't have paradoxes. Well, if we think about what was previously stated, and we call it the Novikov self-consistency principle, what if it was possible? Maybe when the billiard ball came out of the portal, it had a glancing blow, which caused the ball to go into the portal. That's consistent. That would work. This is the Novikov self-consistency principle, and it's basically whatever happened in a way that's non-paradoxical. The nice thing about it is it makes time travel possible, but it introduces some other problems. Namely, it's not like deterministic. We don't know. We know that this is possible to make it consistent. There's lots of solutions where this could be consistent, but we don't know, like, what actually would happen. But it does make time travel possible, which is good because time travel is great. So plausible, done. I was like, there is absolutely no way, no possible way that there is a game that does this. And I started reading and I started researching and I started looking through the games that I played. And I was like, no, dear God, no, this couldn't possibly be it. But I was wrong. I was so very wrong. There is a game that is that complicated. There is a game that actually follows these rules. There is a game that covers the Novikov self-consistency principle. Not as written. They never mention it in the game, as far as I can tell. But it absolutely happens in the game, in the course of the many games in it. There's a game series called the Zero Escape series. It consists of 9 hours per 9 persons, 9 doors, Virtue's Last Reward, and the Zero Time Dilemma. They are all linked in one giant, magnificent, wonderful shenanigans of time travel and multiverse and other stuff. And generally, the less I say about this game, the better. But the thing that I want to point out, just talking about the first game without mentioning too much to spoil it, is there's a point in the game where one character needs information. They need information, otherwise they are going to die. And that information comes to them from the future. In fact, the events in the future are playing out because of the events in the past. Though it was all mystery, no idea that it was time travel. Yeah, it's very mysterious. The game is great on its. The games are great in their own rights, but as it turns out, like, it's not paradoxical. Everything that happens in the game, even though there's a bunch of like back and forth time travel shenanigans, all works out consistently. There's never information that is independent of anything else. We'll talk about this more in paradoxes. If you haven't played any of the games, try the first one. I think it's probably my favorite. It's a visual novel slash escape game series. It is wild. I'm sorry, I'm just taking an eye on time and I gotta speed up. So this is plausible. Just as an example, this is presented in the second game, Virtue's Last Reward. This is legitimately explaining what is happening in the games. If it doesn't make sense to you, that's fine, because I won't be explaining it either. I don't remember it. But like, they thought of this. It's consistent. It checks out. This presents 2 possible timelines, and it actually happens in the game. It is wild. Okay, keeping things moving right along. Let's talk about paradoxes. Yeah, I do have to speed up this panel to 88 miles an hour. Let's talk about paradoxes. Paradoxes are when we are no longer in the realm of plausibility. This is like things are falling apart. This is like we have a time travel video game and it has bugs. The universe has bugs. So we're going to talk about paradoxes. And most games related to time travel are riddled with paradoxes because they're not about time travel as science. They're about time travel as a narrative or as a fun mechanic. So let's talk about them by example. My favorite example, the bootstrap paradox, is one that folks are very familiar with. The bootstrap paradox is like the idea that you can lift yourself up by the bootstraps, which is impossible. You can't do that. And people talk about that sanely in startups and things like that. But also in time travel, it's the idea that like an event was its own cause, or an event exists out of time, or more generally, that something in a time loop has no origin. It just existed because it existed. And this is why it's also called the ontological paradox. Let me know if you can hear this, but this is from a game on the GameCube called Time Splitters. It's a first-person shooter game where you have to stop time crystal using aliens from altering history. Doesn't matter. This is just a good example of a paradox, and I hope you can hear it. I also hope it'll play.
What? But you're me. I knew you'd say that. Here. A key. But what does it... You'll figure it out. Just make sure to pass it on when you're done. Isn't that me?
Sure looks like it.
Yeah, that's right where I was when the other me gave me that key.
Of course, it's a wormhole.
Yeah, so we got 2 things there. We got a wormhole and we also got a paradox. Where did the key come from? It was just always there. They never explain it in the game, and I think possibly just after this, he's like, wait, how did I get the key? Like, they just lampshade it. It's funny, it's goofy. I never finished the game, but like that scene has stuck out in my head as a perfect example demonstrating the grandfather paradox, or the bootstrap paradox. Okay, let's talk about the other kind of paradox, the grandfather, or in my example, the grandmother paradox, which is just more generally referred to as consistency paradoxes. This one's from Chrono Trigger, and it's the idea that something in the future caused something in the past that shouldn't have happened, and it causes like this. This is inconsistent. It doesn't make sense. In Chrono Trigger, so you have this character Marl who joins you at the beginning of the game. She is accidentally mistaken for her great something grandmother, the queen, Convenient. She's a queen. She's got power. This is good. This is a good time for everybody. But the problem is the queen herself went missing. And since the queen went missing, and she was never found, that would mean that the queen's descendants were never born. And if the queen's descendants were never born, that means Marl was never born. And if Marl was never born, then she couldn't have traveled back in time to cause this thing. And if she couldn't have traveled back in time, you get the idea. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's a paradox. It's not possible. And the game doesn't care about paradoxes. That's fine. This is just for a narrative device. And that's why time travel is interesting. It gives you ways to play with reality in ways that we couldn't normally do. But that's a good example of the grandmother paradox, or great grandmother, whatever. I'm going to just touch on this quickly. There's this other thing which is kind of related to philosophy, but not related to science, but comes up with time travel, called Newcomb's paradox, which is, imagine that you had something that could see the future perfectly, predict the future perfectly, which you could do with time travel if you could go back and forth. In that situation, you know exactly what's going to happen. And the perfect part is important here, because that means that whatever you do, no matter what you try, the future will not change. In fact, it means if you try to change the future, that is probably what is causing the changed future to happen. It's bonkers. It's weird. Would you have free will in that situation? Do the choices that you make really matter in that situation? Probably not. And so we're not going to talk about that very long, but it also turns out that the Zero Escape series touches on this a bunch. In the second game, you're trying to prevent a global pandemic through very not straightforward means. Also very present and top of mind because this came out before the pandemic. You're trying to prevent this from happening. As it turns out, all of the things that you've done, everything that you've done up until this point, has merely caused the inevitable to happen. I can't remember if this is in the special ending or if it's in the main ending, but it's like, you caused everything to happen. The third game in the series, Zero Time Dilemma, actually talks a lot more about choice and perhaps the illusion of choice, and that maybe you didn't have a choice the whole way along, and that everything was predetermined, sort of. Also, fun fact, the main character, Junpei, from the first Zero Escape game, basically is inverse Marty McFly. He's got a blue vest instead of a red vest, and a red jacket instead of blue. The game references Back to the Future multiple times, sometimes directly, but they can't say Back to the Future because copyright. And it's play it. Play the games, at least 999. Give it a shot. It's fun. Whipping through some things here. We're going to talk briefly about time loops. Time loops don't really fit into any of our science discussions. A time loop is just when, things keep resetting, or possibly they're second. They're just always existed. But I wanted to recommend a couple time loop games that I think are fun. Just quickly, there's one called Minute, where it's a action adventure action adventure game, kind of like Link to the Past or Link's Awakening, where you get a cursed sword. You die in 60 seconds. Yeah, Zelda game built out of a time loop. Thank you. You have 60 seconds or you die, and you have to uncurse the sword. And you're like, cool, I guess I'll die then. But it turns out through different things you do in the game, you're able to progress, be able to move to different areas, and eventually get the sword uncursed. Cool. There's also Noja, which, do you like Among Us? Do you like visual novels? Do you like RPGs? Do you like social deduction games? Because Noja is a game where these creatures have shown up on your ship. They impersonate humans impressively. That's why you have the two characters there. And they kill humans. That sucks. You have to root them out and kill them before they kill you. Except every time that you succeed or fail, time resets itself. And there are some elements that carry over, things that are consistent between the different playthroughs, but sometimes there are different characters. Sometimes the details of people change, their origins, etc. There's a meta narrative. It's good. I have only played a little bit, but I recommend it. Okay, whipping through here. Let's talk again about real world time travel again. We're not going to talk about quantum physics. I'm not an expert, but we're going to talk about one area that intersects with time travel, and that is the many worlds interpretation. And in order to talk about that, I need to ask, have you ever heard of Schrodinger's cat? I say that with a straight face, even though that is from one very memeable section of Zero Escape Virtue's Last Reward. Yeah, everybody, yeah, people who are familiar with me. Yeah, cool. The experiment works as such. You put a cat in a box, it's alive. You put poison in a box, it's poison, it will kill the cat. And you put radioactive material in a box. The radioactive material emits radioactive decay, which will set off some trigger, which will release the poison. Yes, exactly. Some people in the chat are familiar with this. Until you open the box, it's unclear if the cat is dead or alive. And one resolution for this in quantum physics is the cat is both alive and dead, which is nonsense. But for our purposes in time travel, another perspective, another interpretation of that is in one universe, the cat is alive, and in the other universe, the cat is dead. And like, that's cool because that means, one, it's plausible, both in this game and in general. And two, it means time travel is possible. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, or what have you, it would imply that there are most likely an uncountable number of different universes, and that time is a many branch tree where quantum possibilities possible. Everything's possible. And that means you can have your multiverse, you can have your alternate histories, you can have different timelines. It all checks out. And guess what? I have recommendations for that as well. There are tons of games where you can make choices, where they can affect history, all of that. But I've played or watched these two, and one of them is a real trip, and the other one is interesting. So we're just going to briefly mention that. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is another visual novel / real-time tactics game where you start out as a character in 1980s Japan, and he just likes playing video games and watching definitely not Back to the Future. And then a robot shows up, and then somehow you end up getting sent back in time. But there are also robots there, but they're not in the present. And it only gets more complicated from there, and it's really satisfying. But what makes it interesting narratively and time travel related is you have different time periods, and you have 13 characters, and you have to try to weave together what the heck is going on in the game, despite the numerous seeming paradoxes and contradiction. So that's wild. AI, the Somnium Files, is a little bit more straightforward. It's more of a you make choices kind of thing. But it's a visual novel adventure game set in the near future where you have to try to solve a series of murders, the Cyclops killings. But in order to do that, you have to enter people's mind. You have to do mind taking. Not exactly. And what happens is you often follow a plot until it ends, and then you're like, well, that didn't seem to resolve the killings. So you have to go back, not in time, just like to your mind palace to revisit an earlier moment, and use the knowledge that you've gained from these other universes. Does that play out in terms of story stuff? I don't know. I'm just going to quickly touch on this game just because it's an example. I mentioned mutable timelines at the beginning. We don't know if time is branching or if there's multiple timelines or whatever. Eternal Threads is a mostly narrative game that really lets you play with this. There's an important event in time. There was a fire in London, and you have to make all the people in it survive. And to do that, you need to play out the events and like make small tweaks to people's lives so that they all survive, so that time cannot suck. And it's a little hard to get it's mostly a narrative game, but it like lets you see that like when you make a change in the past, it ripples forward into the future. It's an example of a mutable timeline. Apologies if I'm whipping through visual novel Amnesia. I don't know what that is. I'm curious. Higher dimensions. I mentioned this because time can be thought of as a fourth dimension, and so we can think of dimensions, 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions. We're familiar with that. We live in 3 dimensions. We technically live in 4 dimensions, but we can't see it. We can project it. It doesn't make sense to us. And there's probably other dimensions that we can't see that exist in our universe. If you're a scientist, maybe you even know what those are. But there are games that let you explore the 4th dimension in different ways. There's this one game called Megakure, which has been in development for a long time. It's a hide and reveal puzzle game where you can navigate in 4-dimensional spaces. It's not time. Time is not the 4th dimension, but it lets you like wrap your head around thinking with an additional dimension. But in an example that I'm coming back to that actually is time travel and is a game and is chess. There's a game called 5D Chess with multiverse time travel. I don't remember the rules. I remember that you can keep playing as long as you haven't lost your king in all timelines. But you can move through dimensions. You can move through time. You can send pieces back in time. It is wild. And it's probably the most approachable sense to time travel you can get, although good luck. I do not have that big brain energy. This is plausible. I've maybe gone slightly too fast, but that's good because we're approaching the end of our time together. And I have one more slide, but I did want to leave with a kind of parting thought to all of this. Because we've been talking about time travel, and time travel is amazing. You get this opportunity to experience a different time period. You get to relive something that you can never experience again. You get to spend time with a loved one who might have passed. Maybe you get to meet somebody for the first time or ever. But if you can travel through time, you can also make things right. You'd be like, Hitler gone. We've seen how that repercussion plays out in different video games. But like, maybe that's what you want to do. Maybe you want to stop some other tragedy. It's like, if we knew this, we could have done this. You can make different choices. You can start over. You can try it again. That's what's so really cool about time travel mechanically and narratively. It represents this possibility of things. And when we talk about time travel, we're like, oh man, if you change the past, that's so dangerous. If you squash a bug in prehistoric times, like humans might not ever exist. It's so radically mind-alteringly like bad. Don't mess around with the past. I mean, Back to the Future, they're like, don't do this. It's bad. You might not exist anymore, and you can see that play out in real time. We joke about that. But when we take the same logic and apply it to the present, we're like, we're not like don't do this thing. When we try to think about changing things in the present, somehow it's different. We don't think of it as this thing that can ripple forwards in history, having huge ramifications. We just don't think it's possible. It's like, why bother? This couldn't possibly impact anything. And I want to remind people that we don't need time travel to do these big life-changing sorts of things. It's cool. Like, if we could do time travel, that'd be great. I mean, it would probably cause a lot of problems. But like, we don't need time travel to do that. Today, a small act of kindness, being a little bit more empathetic, maybe even just making a tiny donation to a good cause, like the Canadian Mental Health Association that Kanji is raising money for this weekend. Even those little changes have big rippling impacts that go outward into the future. You want to get fit, you don't need to like run a marathon today. You can like go for a walk. If you want to learn something, you can just read. If you want to read more, you can read a page a day. That seems stupid, but it works. You can do that. And so even though time travel is really cool and I love it, we don't need it to make some of the big changes that we see. Yeah, so that's my parting thought. But also one more slide. Well, two more slides, technically. There were so many things that I couldn't cover, so many games that I couldn't cover. Here's a big list of other games that involve time travel or time travel adjacent things. I've highlighted some games that I either want to play or play more of. Slay the Princess is a visual novel game. It's fantastic. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist has like wibbly wobbly, timely wimey stuff, and also lots of choices. Steins Gate is supposed to be like ball your eyes out, but I haven't played it yet. And there are tons of other time travel related games. But a lot of them are time loops, a lot of them are paradoxes, some of them are just things. You don't want to mess with her. But that's it. That's everything that I had to say about time travel. Thank you so much, Kanji. If you're trying to learn more about me, anytime I do some other shenanigans like this, I'm at Entropy pretty much everywhere. Enterp. I stream at the Race Against Time. I do a bunch of time-related stuff, including mostly Chrono Trigger. And yeah, that's it for me.